in 2026, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be surrounding ourselves with consultants who don't do either research on a regular basis themselves, or at very least partner with stakeholders who do applied research on a regular basis. Maybe you don't have the mechanisms in place. Maybe you don't have the personnel required. Maybe you don't have what's needed to actually do that research yourself. But at very least, you've got to partner yourself with people who do research and can do it in a applied situation, which is similar to your own. Research coming out of wherever it may be. I mean, there's very interesting research that comes out of Spain, of China, various different places, which can be really interesting. But when we talk about that validity again, depending on the subject being studied, the external validity might not be quite as good as the study is coming out of maybe not your neighbor's farm, but somebody down the road.
Welcome to the Swine Canada podcast show, brought to you by Wisenetics. So we are dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the Canadian pork industry. So my name is Miranda Smith, and I'll be the host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Dr. Stephen Frazer, who is a swine veterinarian at Demeter Veterinary Services. So welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you.
So today we're going to be talking about field research. But before we get started on that, can you first give a little bit of an introduction to your background and what you're doing in your current role?
Yeah, so I'm a swine veterinarian, as you mentioned, at Demeter, and been out for about a year working with them. And my background is actually both Doctor of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Montreal, and also did a Master's of Veterinary Science at the same time. So I always had a little bit of interest in research, and one of the things that I've appreciated with Demeter is that we've doing a lot of research, and we do a lot of internal research projects. So subject is very interesting to me.
Okay, awesome. So that is a good introduction to our topic of today, which is field research. So it sounds like you're doing some of that in your current role. So can you first tell us, what is field research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think field research is maybe a little bit more complex than the question might seem to appear. Field research can take a lot of different shapes and forms, and I think research has become a bit of a grab bag for a lot of different things. For instance, you can have maybe a cursory research project where you basically stick one type of enrichment in half your pens and another type of enrichment in another half your pens, and then just do a comparison of closeout performance between those two sets of pens. And it's very unlikely that you'll see the exact same numbers in those two batches. So you might be inclined to just immediately switch to one form of enrichment or something like that. But if you think about it, the chances were actually quite high that there'd be a little bit of a difference between those two groups of pens. So when I think about field research, I'm really thinking about approaching it from a robust perspective, not going at it kind of willy-nilly and seeing what's better. We really want to listen to clientele and hear if they've tried something new, and then really apply it in a field setting with robust scientific methodology. Want to apply it also in a real world production setting, and this is maybe what distinguishes us a bit from university research, but applying a rigorous scientific method to real world production settings with a goal to increase the quality and profitability of the swine industry. And there are several key differences between what I just described, the informal pen-to-pen comparison, and actual field research. And two of those differences would be statistical power and experimental design. In proper field research, we're calculating sample sizes ahead of time. So we're asking questions like, how many pens do I need to have a really meaningful difference? What constitutes a meaningful difference between groups? For instance, if I'm looking at seroconversion, I'm going to want to know, am I detecting an improved difference on ELISA? Am I detecting a difference on IFA? Am I looking at clinical signs? What am I looking at to detect that difference? And how big of a difference am I trying to detect? Number of animals is going to change a lot based on that target.
So basically, you're doing research as if you're in a university setting, except you apply it on commercial farms, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're absolutely trying to get that same rigor that you would have with a university project as much as possible, trying to get that in a commercial setting.
Well, it's funny because I actually do the exact same thing for my job. So
Swine Veterinary Partners comprises 4 well-established clinics across Canada: Precision Veterinary Services, Premier SHP, Demeter, Ontario, and Demeter, Quebec.
So I know a little bit about how challenging it can sometimes be, but it's also very rewarding. So like you already mentioned a little bit, like some differences between universities and field research, but can you go into a little bit more detail on like some of the advantages and limitations of field research?
So if we're talking about the difference between university and field research, they are definitely very synergistic. And I want to be really clear about that. There's a lot of overlap between them, but there are a lot of very overlapping goals there. And they are slightly different, though. One of the big reasons that we have field research and why it's so important is there is the economic aspect, which you might not see with a lot of university research. Universities are well placed to discover basic biological phenomenon and to look at the exact what's going on. However, they are a little bit more poorly placed to tell if a given treatment is economically viable. In fact, in my experience, it's not necessarily the goal of university research in a lot of cases. Their goal is to kind of advance general knowledge that can be quoted in the future. They want to produce core research, which isn't necessarily going to change in the next 5 years, whereas the economics of various different products are going to change enormously between here and even 2 years from now. It could be very different. And I hesitate to oversimplify, but broadly speaking, university research has that goal, whereas research in a field setting tends to have more of that economics included. As a general rule, terminal or applied research has those models really included in the research. And you can think of research in terms of, I don't know, like a stream where you have some of that first research going in. You got maybe a research project in a university where they look at cytokines, which might cause cell death in a test tube. Well, that's very interesting, but for me as a practitioner, that makes no difference to me, right? I can't go and play in those cytokines directly. I have no idea what that's gonna do. I don't know when those cytokines are gonna be high. So I don't really have a lot of information that I can use with my producer when I'm on the farm with him. But another researcher might come along and they might find that a particular molecule might affect that cytokine. Another researcher might come along and in the university setting might find that cytokine is elevated when you're dealing with a PRRS outbreak, with a mycoplasma outbreak, or whatever it might be. And then somebody else might come along and demonstrate that in a certain disease condition, you can use that molecule on actual animals and show that you can actually affect that disease process and increase the health of the animals overall. In a research setting in a university, they're advancing that general knowledge. They're generating citation. They're creating very interesting information. And a lot of researchers in universities keep themselves very well connected with the practitioners so that their core research stays connected with those things that are important for us in the field. But as a general rule, and again, I know I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but as a general rule, their goal is going to be that advancement of general knowledge. Whereas when we start doing the field research, in my mind, one of the most important things that we're looking at is economics. And we're doing research in our group. We always sit down and discuss beforehand. Is this actually going to be worth it to the producer? If we're testing a new product or protocol or what it may be, we're going to want to start asking, what's that potential impact for the producer? What's that potential economic advantage for the producer, or whatever it may be?
Well, I've also noticed that, like on my end, like it's on the one hand, it's the economics, right? But then you also have the labor aspect. So like on universities, they don't really look at that because there's a research technician and the student, and, they have all the help available to do whatever they need to do. But then when you put it into a commercial farm, suddenly it's like, well, I have to pay someone to do this. So it cannot be overly labor intensive, whatever it is that you're asking me to do, right? So that's what I've noticed is a big factor in field research versus universities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And matter of fact, this is one of the things I found really interesting. We were at the AASV recently. There was one of the producers there was talking about the way that they do research at their company. It's a large company in the United States. And they were talking about the prioritization matrix they use when they're looking at a study. And one of the things they use as a prioritization criteria for doing a research project is how easily is this going to be to implement? What is the cost going to be in terms of labor? That's definitely a very, very important point. And it's one that we can't forget about when we're doing applied research is not just what does this product cost, but also what does it cost to the producer to give this? And that's going to vary differently between different clients. But absolutely, that's a important point of field research.
Okay, so then like going back to like the question that I had earlier, so we've talked a little bit about like the differences between university and field research, but what are the advantages and limitations of field research?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of it comes down to that advantage you're talking about, the economic aspect that we've been talking about for a little while now, and talking to ourselves about how valid is this as well in a field setting. In statistics, we talk about external and internal validity of a project, and maybe not terms that we use a lot in everyday conversation, but there are actually millions of studies out there which are not valid to apply in production. I think the classic example is if you imagine a study which shows that a particular feeding regime might be excellent for feed conversion or excellent for average daily gain of where it may be, and you might think, oh, that's the greatest study in the world. We're going to go out and we're going to apply this in our feeder barns. But then if you look at the study and it's applied in feedlot cattle, then all of a sudden that study becomes a lot less interesting, right? So that's kind of an extreme example where the external validity of the study is very poor. But there are a lot of cases that are not quite so cut and dry. There are cases where it's probably good, but it's a slightly different genetics. It's a slightly different feeding protocol. It's a slightly different medication protocol. It's a slightly different this, slightly different that. And in fact, you can never, and this is an interesting mathematical phenomenon, you can never arrive at 100% validity of a study. You just can't. You can't arrive at that 100%. It's always going to elude you. You can arrive at maybe 95% or 99% if you got something which is really similar to your conditions on farm, but you can't arrive at that 100%. And essentially, the closer your study population is to your population on farm, the more similarity there is between the animals, between the lodging, between the feeding, between the management practices, between the environment, the better that external validity of your study as applied on your farm is going to be.
Like I've also noticed like a difference is often disease status, right? Like I think a lot of the research done by universities, like they have generally a higher health herd. So that's like another difference. As soon as you go out into commercial farms, like you'll find all kinds of different disease statuses. And so what works on the research farm may not necessarily work in real life, just because like suddenly like these pigs are, as you mentioned, like they're living under different circumstances, different management, right? So that can totally change the story.
Oh, absolutely. And we just recently did a project where we were looking at various different treatment groups, and we did our study. We got to the end and we found that the effect was not what we were necessarily expecting, but part of that was exactly what you're talking about. The health status of the animals was not what was ideal. And when we were giving that treatment, there may have been some effects of health that came into play on that. So it gives other information as well, because it tells us how the treatment responds to a health challenge of a particular type. But it's also that kind of information which, and you're absolutely right, that's not information that we necessarily get from the university setting, which we can get in these field trials.
So any other limitations that you can think of?
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely other limitations which can come into play, and I mean we could go on for a while. But one of the limitations is that and it can be controls in terms of how the management is applied, and differences from, for instance, is things as simple as the weekend staff may not have the same protocols as the staff on during the week, and you don't necessarily have that oversight which you'd have in a university setting to make sure that everything is exactly carried out detail by detail from one day to another the same.
But on the other hand, like it is still really important that we do this, right? So
absolutely.
So yeah, like can you then talk a little bit about like how doing field research can actually help the swine industry?
Absolutely, field research 100% helps the swine industry, but only to the extent that you do it. And we've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but field research really helps the swine industry bridge that gap between the university pure applied research, pure research, and kind of the commercial implementation. Universities and the research which is done can give us kind of that foundation. They tell us that X molecule might affect this disease in this way, or it can affect this intervention can help this parameter under controlled situations. But there can be a bit of a gap between knowing that something works in a research facility and knowing whether it's going to be profitable on a commercial farm with all the messiness that comes with real production. And when I say to the extent that you do it, it's and this is another very important way that field research helps the swine industry, is by staying up to date with modern practices, modern genetics. One of the first projects I did the statistics for when I started working for Demeter tested the usage of a particular product. I need to go into the exact study, but in the past, it's given us excellent results for a certain production parameter. But the effect that it's had on that production parameter is very similar to the effect that improving genetics has had, improving nutrition has had over the past years. So we kind of wondered whether this product is still as beneficial as it used to be. And when we did the statistical analysis, I dug really deep. I binned, I tried filtering outliers. I even tried stretching normality assumptions, all sorts of stuff, just trying to figure out, is there any effect that we can kind of dig into to figure out what's going on with this thing? And at the end, I came to the conclusion that in the majority of situations, this product was not necessarily worth giving for that prediction parameter. And that's not to say that product is a bad product. It's an excellent product and it can be used in certain situations. I still recommend it for certain producers for certain issues. But in the particular situation where we were using it prior, it was not necessarily the best option. So like this is an example of research that if we just kind of relied on old research projects, our clients might just keep spending money to systematically use that product. And I should clarify again that it's a good product, it's an excellent product. We still use the product, but in that particular situation, it wasn't the best option when we use the modern genetic lines and modern feeding strategies. So recency is really important. And I think as consultants, we have to do a certain amount of continuing education, but we also have to make sure that that's up to date. And some of that field research can help us keep really up to date and right on the cutting edge of what's going on and what's going on with the modern genetics, feeding, even the transfer to gestation pens is going to make a huge difference on certain things as well as we approach 2029. So it's just staying on the cutting edge of knowledge with that field research.
Yeah. So, do you have specific producers that you usually like to go to for field research, or is it kind of like different all the time?
It's a good question. We definitely got some of our producers who are a lot more research minded, and there are certain producers where we're constantly doing research projects in those production systems. There are some of them that actually ask us to do research projects with them so that they have information on that exact farm. And as a matter of fact, once you get to some certain size, and I don't know what that size is, but some size, it becomes worth it for you to actually do internal research with your particular method of doing things. Any of the big companies that are raising tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of sows, they're all going to be doing their own research internally as well to make sure that their particular systems are working. And we sometimes do it in research in productions where, like I said, they ask us to do it, or we've got other producers where we work out something with them so we can do research in those farms.
So for the producers that come to you, like for them, it's like very beneficial, obviously, that if you get it done in your own farm, like you know exactly what it's going to do in your situation. But like, what about like the other producers that are not part of this? Like, is it still going to be helpful for them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It comes back to that question of external validity, right? The study can be valid, but is it valid for my production? And that validity, if I'm in the same production system, I've got the same feed, I got the same genetics, I got the same setup that I had last year, the probability that my study that I did last year is going to be viable and it's going to have the same results in my production today are very high. Whereas if I'm in a new production where maybe I've got a farm that's 20 miles down the street that's got results, well, they're similar. They've maybe got the same genetic line. They've maybe got some of the similar parameters. But there's always a little bit less external validity to that farm because it's not actually done in those exact situations. You don't have the same personnel coming in. You don't have the same number of hours where you're on farm even. It can be as simple as the equipment. It can be the cages are a slightly different size, and that can affect maybe your stillborns. You have a slightly more stillborns in this production, so the results of your research project are not going to come out the same.
So Can you talk a little bit about like some examples of field research that you've done with Demeter?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'd go into a whole bunch of details on all the projects that we do, partly because some of that information we keep for our clientele, obviously, but we do a lot of research for where we try to apply various different protocols, vaccination protocols, various different products that we try out. Whenever there's something new coming out that comes out, we try to test it internally with our clientele. Even the way that we do tests. There is a new testing protocol that came out of Iowa State that we started trying internally to make sure that it actually works as well in our clientele as it worked out of those situations. So just making sure that everything we have is really on the cutting edge and making sure that we're up to date on everything.
So is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we haven't talked about yet today?
One of the things is the way that we do statistics in field research. One of the benefits of doing field research is that we can actually set up those statistics to manage a project in terms of economics. I take an example. I was doing work on one project that we were studying various different products. So we're trying, for instance, product A, B, C, and we're trying these different products versus some negative controls. So the control group that didn't receive that product. And from a pure research perspective, it might be interesting to know if product A performs worse than control. Right, you might be interested in knowing, does giving this product make pigs perform less well than they did if they received nothing? But from an applied research perspective, if you think about it, when I show up on a farm, the situation of the product does not perform at all and the product performs worse than expected are essentially equivalent, right? If I show up on a farm and I say to the client, hey, here's a product that we've demonstrated makes your mortality go up. And you can pay $10 per animal to have this product. I'm inventing numbers, but you can pay $10 for this product to make your mortality go up. The producer's going to look at me and go, like, if you lost your mind, you're nuts. I'm not going to pay to make my mortality go up. It's ridiculous. But he's going to have essentially the same reaction if I show up there and say, I've got this product. It makes no difference whatsoever if you give it. And you can pay $10 for the product. He's still going to look at me like I'm nuts. He's still going to go, good grief, like what's the deal? Why are we trying to sell this with? My point is that regardless whether there's no effect or if the effect is negative, there's similar situations. And this may not mean a lot to some of our listeners, but that makes a difference in the way that you do statistical analysis. You can do a one-tail test instead of doing a two-tail test because you know that those situations are equivalent before you even start. Whereas in maybe a pure research setting, that might be more interesting to delve into. Is this one worse? Why is it worse? What's going on there? And that can be interesting as an avenue for the future. Whereas for me as a practitioner, I'm trying to show up on a farm and bring the producer something which actually helps him economically in his business. And so I'm going to be looking at those two situations in a very similar way.
Very interesting.
And maybe another point that I might make is that we're really not trying to say that we're pitting university research against field research. These are really synergistic. We both need each other enormously. Like these things work really, and the best research projects are when we get a synergism between those two, where those two really kind of get married and work together towards a common goal. If you can get those practitioners and university researchers together working on a project towards a common goal, that's the best research you can possibly get, in my mind. But we need some of that core research as well, right? If you don't have that core research, you can't go into those applied research. If we don't do that study on those cytokines, if we don't look into those interleukins, what's that effect on the core cellular level? If you don't do those test tube experiments, then we can't have those applied studies. Those studies have to be done before in order for us to get to the point where we're doing those applied research studies.
Yeah, it's basically like a scale from like very basic to very practical, and we need it all.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. So anything else that you like, any last take-home messages for the listeners?
I think one of the take-home messages would be that in 2026, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be surrounding ourselves with consultants who don't do either research on a regular basis themselves, or at very least partner with stakeholders who do applied research on a regular basis. Maybe you don't have the mechanisms in place. Maybe you don't have the personnel required. Maybe you don't have what's needed to actually do that research yourself. But at very least, you've got to partner yourself with people who do research and can do it in a applied situation, which is similar to your own. Research coming out of wherever it may be. I mean, there's very interesting research that comes out of Spain, of China, various different places, which can be really interesting. But when we talk about that validity again, depending on the subject being studied, the external validity might not be quite as good as the study that's coming out of maybe not your neighbor's farm, but somebody down the road. And it might be it might be extremely relevant information coming out of those articles, but they don't have the same disease patterns. They don't have the same feed. They don't have the same minerals in their water. Even it can be simple as that. They don't have the same genetics and all those different things. So yeah, just making sure that you have yourselves surrounded by people who are doing those research projects, and also, I guess, like in technology, they talk about the adoption curve of various different new ideas, and you have like around, I don't know, it's like 15% of people who fall into the innovators, the early adopters category. You got like those 35% that fall into the majority the early majority, and then you got like a 35% that fall into the late majority, and you got kind of laggers, people who lag to implement it after everyone else has shown that it works. And as producers and consultants, we have to figure out where we fall in that curve. Like, are we those early adopters who want to really be on the cutting edge and surround yourself with people who do that applied research and put it into place right away before there's, like, when you've got those first studies that come out that show there's maybe an effect on this thing, then we put it into place right away? Or do we wait until we're in those early adopters? The place where we don't want to be is kind of on those late adopters, or especially on those laggers, where we wait until everybody's had the benefit, and now we're like 10 years behind, and now we're finally implementing something which we've known for 10 years is causing an advantage.
Okay, perfect message. Thank you.
It's time for our famous three.
Okay, so to our listeners, if you're enjoying this episode of the Swine Canada podcast show presented by Genetics, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with your colleagues, friends, and family. All right, so that gets us to the final three questions, which are the same for all our guests. So the first one is, what is your favorite swine-related book or resource?
Oh, I have to say, I can love just sitting down with diseases of swine and reading articles on these rare diseases. That's kind of fun.
I had a feeling that book might be the one you would choose as a vet, because that's what most vets choose.
That's fair.
It sounds like it's a really good book. Okay, so what about a favorite book or resource outside of agriculture?
Yeah, one resource that I really have found really interesting, and it's not swine related at all, but it was recommended to me by one of my mentors out in beef medicine when I was doing a bit of beef. And it's the book Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss and Tal Raz, which is a very interesting book, which talks about kind of the negotiating style that we have to be employing. It's something we need to be using as much as possible with our interventions with everyone, trying to figure out how do we get to that best case scenario as easily as possible.
That sounds like a good book. I should look it up. Okay. So in your opinion, what sets successful swine professionals apart from those that are not?
Well, I'm not going to surprise you by saying I think part of it is being on the cutting edge.
Thought you might go for that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's not right in the theme of the podcast, right? So
yes.
So definitely got to be on the cutting edge there, making sure you're keeping up to date and everything, and hopefully inventing some of the new stuff.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Swine Canada podcast show today.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that concludes another episode of the Swine Canada podcast show. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcasts to stay updated on future episodes. So thanks everyone for listening, and until next time.